I let my stepmom and her kids celebrate their inheritance at Dad's funeral, then watch their faces when the real will was read. Dad died on a Tuesday. Victoria had the funeral planned by Thursday. We need to make this elegant, she announced, flipping through catering menus while I sat beside his hospital bed. Raymond would want something sophisticated. My father had been dead for 6 hours. His body was still warm when she started planning how to spend his money, already calculating which caterer would impress the right people and which flowers would photograph best for her social media tribute. Victoria had moved into our house when I was 15, arriving like a perfectly manicured tornado that destroyed everything in its path. She brought her twins, Ethan and Zoe, who were my age but acted like they owned the place from day one. Dad was so smitten with her bleached smile and yoga-toned body that he didn't notice how they'd systematically erased every trace of my mother from our home. The transformation didn't happen overnight. Victoria was too smart for that. She understood that dramatic changes would raise suspicions, so she worked slowly, methodically, like a surgeon removing healthy tissue one piece at a time. It started with small rearrangements. Victoria would move things while Dad was at work, claiming she was just organizing and making the space more functional. Mom's favorite coffee mug, a chipped ceramic piece I'd made in 3rd grade art class, disappeared from the kitchen cabinet. When I asked about it, Victoria said it must have been accidentally broken during cleaning. "These things happen," she said with practiced sympathy. "I'm sure your mother would understand." Mom's reading chair, a comfortable overstuffed armchair where she'd spent countless evenings reading to me, got moved to the basement because it didn't match the aesthetic Victoria was creating. The family photos on the mantle were gradually replaced with Victoria's professional headshots and glamour shots of the twins. "We need to blend our families visually," she explained when I protested. "It's important for your father to see us as a unified unit." But I knew the truth. Victoria wasn't helping Dad heal or blending our families. She was methodically erasing my mother's existence to make room for herself, like painting over a masterpiece with cheap house paint. The psychological manipulation was subtle, but relentless. Victoria would make comments about how unhealthy it was for Dad to cling to memories of his deceased wife, how important it was for him to move forward and embrace new possibilities. She'd frame every suggestion as being for his own good, positioning herself as the caring woman who wanted to help him heal. "Grief counselors recommend removing triggers," she'd say while boxing up Mom's belongings. "Your father needs space to build new memories without constantly being reminded of his loss." When I protested that these weren't triggers but cherished memories, Victoria would sigh and explain that I was too young to understand the complexities of adult grief. "Your father is trying to build a new life," she'd say. "Don't you want him to be happy?" The implication was clear. If I truly loved Dad, I'd support Victoria's efforts to replace everything my mother had been to him. Victoria was methodical in her approach to isolating Dad from his past. She started by suggesting that his old friends reminded him too much of his life with Mom, that seeing them was keeping him stuck in grief. She'd schedule conflicts whenever his longtime buddies wanted to get together, or she'd plan elaborate family activities that made it impossible for him to maintain his previous social connections. "Raymond needs to focus on the future," she'd tell people who called. "He's building something beautiful with our blended family." Within a year, Dad had lost touch with most of his longtime friends. Victoria replaced them with her own social circle, divorced women and their children who reinforced her narrative about moving on and embracing new beginnings. The financial manipulation began with small requests that seemed reasonable. Victoria needed money for the twins' school supplies, then their extracurricular activities, then their college preparation courses. Each request was framed as an investment in their shared future as a family. "Ethan has such potential," she'd say while showing Dad acceptance letters to expensive programs. "With the right opportunities, he could really make something of himself." Dad, who had always valued education and hard work, was happy to support what he believed were legitimate educational expenses. What he didn't realize was that Victoria was systematically redirecting funds from my college savings into accounts she controlled. The college fund that Mom and Dad had been building since I was born suddenly became a family education fund that somehow only funded Ethan and Zoe's activities. When I questioned this, Victoria had elaborate explanations about tax benefits and education planning that made Dad's eyes glaze over. "It's much more efficient to pool resources," she'd explain. "This way, all the children benefit equally." But the benefits were never equal. Ethan got a BMW for his 16th birthday while I got a lecture about the value of taking the bus. Zoe got a shopping spree at Nordstrom while I was told that thrift stores built character. The twins got private tutoring and college prep courses while I was encouraged to consider community college as a more practical option. Victoria's masterstroke was convincing Dad to refinance the house to pay for the twins' private school tuition. She presented it as a smart financial move, claiming that property values were rising and they could take advantage of low interest rates. "We're investing in the children's future," she said, showing Dad glossy brochures from elite preparatory schools. "This education will open doors for them that could change their entire lives." What Victoria didn't mention was that refinancing the house meant that a significant portion of Dad's equity that should have been part of my inheritance, was now tied up in monthly payments that would continue long after the twins graduated. By my senior year of high school, I felt like a stranger in my own home. Victoria had redecorated every room in beige and gold, claiming it was more sophisticated than Mom's warm blues and greens. She'd hired an interior designer who specialized in transitional spaces, apparently code for erasing all evidence that another woman had ever lived there. The designer, a rail-thin woman named Celeste who spoke in hushed tones about energy flow and emotional cleansing, worked with Victoria to create what they called a forward-looking environment. "We're helping your father release attachment to the past," Celeste explained when I found them rearranging Mom's china cabinet. "These new pieces will help him embrace the present moment." Mom's china cabinet, which had held 4 generations of family heirlooms, was replaced with a sleek modern display case filled with Victoria's collection of crystal wine glasses and designer ceramics. The family heirlooms were stored in the basement, temporarily, though Victoria made it clear she considered them outdated and impractical. The emotional manipulation reached its peak during my senior year. Victoria began a campaign to convince Dad that I was becoming rebellious and ungrateful, that I resented their happiness and was trying to sabotage their family unity. "She's at that age where girls test boundaries," Victoria would say when I questioned her decisions. "It's important that we present a united front, or she'll try to manipulate us against each other." Victoria was an expert at timing her conversations with Dad. She'd wait until he was tired and stressed from work to suggest new rules that always benefited her children at my expense. She'd frame every restriction as being for my own good, every privilege granted to the twins as being necessary for their development. "College prep students need more sleep," she'd say about my 9 p.m. curfew, while Ethan and Zoe were allowed to stay out until dawn. "Too much social activity interferes with academic focus," she'd explain when she banned my friends from the house, while hosting elaborate pool parties for the twins' social circle. The breaking point came during my high school graduation. Victoria had planned an elaborate celebration for Ethan and Zoe, who were graduating the same day from their private school. My graduation ceremony was at 2 p.m. Their party was scheduled to start at 3 p.m. at our house. "We can't reschedule," Victoria explained when I pointed out that this timing would make it impossible for our family to properly celebrate my graduation. "The caterers are already booked, and we've sent invitations. You understand how these things work." I sat alone at my graduation ceremony, watching other families take photos and celebrate their children's achievements, while my father checked his watch anxiously, clearly eager to get home for Victoria's party. He left immediately after my name was called, missing the scholarship awards ceremony, where I received 3 additional grants for academic excellence. When I arrived home with my cap and gown, the house was full of people I didn't recognize, celebrating Ethan's admission to USC and Zoe's acceptance to the Fashion Institute of Technology. My graduation cap and gown were hanging forgotten on a kitchen chair while Ethan held court in the living room, discussing his future fraternity plans and the convertible Victoria had promised to buy him for college. "There she is," Victoria announced when she spotted me, her voice carrying that particular tone she used when she wanted to publicly diminish me while appearing supportive. "Our little scholar. Tell everyone about your community college plans." The laughter that followed felt like acid in my veins. I hadn't told anyone I was going to community college because I wasn't. I'd been accepted to Northwestern with a partial scholarship, but Victoria had been systematically undermining my plans by telling people I wasn't college material and that Dad couldn't afford to send me to a real university. That night, I overheard Victoria on the phone with her sister, discussing their long-term strategy with the kind of cold calculation that made my blood freeze. "Raymond's completely devoted now," she said, her voice carrying the satisfaction of someone whose plan was working perfectly. "He barely remembers what his first wife was like. I've been very careful to help him process his grief and move forward." "What about his daughter?" her sister asked. "She'll age out soon enough," Victoria replied with casual dismissal. 18-year-olds move on. It's natural progression. Once she's out of the house, she'll fade from his priorities. The twins will be his real children, the ones he's invested in emotionally and financially. I realized then that this had never been about love or marriage or blending families. Victoria was running a long con, systematically isolating Dad from his past and his daughter to secure her family's financial future. She wasn't just stealing his money, she was stealing his memory, his identity, and his relationship with me. The next morning, I confronted Dad directly about what I'd overheard. "Victoria is trying to replace me," I said, sitting across from him at the breakfast table while Victoria was at her yoga class. "She's erasing Mom's memory and pushing me out so her kids can inherit everything." Dad's face went cold in a way I'd never seen before. The man who had taught me to ride a bike and helped me with homework for 12 years looked at me like I was a stranger making unreasonable demands. "Victoria has been nothing but kind to you," he said, his voice flat and distant. "She's trying to blend our families, and you're making it impossible with your jealousy and resentment." "Dad, please just listen to what I'm saying." "No, you listen," he said, standing up and pacing the kitchen. "Victoria and I are getting married next month. Her children will officially become my stepchildren, and I expect you to treat them with respect and gratitude. If you can't handle that, maybe it's time you found your own place." The wedding was small and elegant, held in our backyard among Mom's rose garden that Victoria had ripped out and replaced with minimalist landscaping. I wasn't asked to be in the wedding party. Instead, I served drinks to guests while Zoe played maid of honor, and Ethan walked Victoria down the aisle in place of her absent father. During the ceremony, Victoria wore Mom's wedding veil, the one piece of her wedding outfit that had survived Victoria's purge. When I asked Dad about it later, he said Victoria had found it in the attic and thought it would be a nice way to honor my mother's memory. "She's including your mother in our new beginning," he said, completely missing the violation of seeing another woman wear my mother's most precious possession. After the ceremony, Victoria pulled me aside with the kind of fake sympathy she'd perfected over the past 3 years. "I know this is difficult," she said, adjusting the veil that had no right to be on her head, "but your father and I want what's best for everyone. You're welcome here as long as you accept that things have changed permanently." What she meant was, fall in line or get out. I chose community college over student loans I couldn't afford and moved into a tiny studio apartment near campus. Dad helped with the deposit, but made it clear this was his final contribution to my independence. "Victoria thinks it's important you learn self-reliance," he explained while handing me a check that covered exactly 1 month's rent. "She believes too much financial support creates dependency." For the next 2 years, I watched from the outside as Victoria completed her takeover of Dad's life. His construction business, which had been his pride and joy for 25 years, got restructured to include Victoria as co-owner and financial manager. The twins were added to all his bank accounts as beneficiaries. Even Dad's life insurance policy was updated to list Victoria as the primary beneficiary and the twins as secondary, with me removed entirely from the policy. I tried maintaining a relationship with Dad, calling weekly and visiting for holidays, but every conversation felt scripted and supervised. Victoria was always hovering, steering discussions away from the past and toward the twins' endless accomplishments. Ethan made Dean's List again, she'd announced during Sunday dinners, beaming with pride. Zoe's internship at the fashion magazine is going wonderfully, she'd add. They're considering offering her a full-time position after graduation. When I mentioned my own successes, making honor roll, getting promoted at my campus job, earning a scholarship for my final semester, the responses were polite but distant, like Dad was hearing about the achievements of a casual acquaintance rather than his daughter. "That's nice, dear," he'd say, before launching into a detailed story about Ethan's fraternity leadership position or Zoe's latest photography project. I realized that Victoria had successfully rewritten Dad's definition of family. I was now the outsider, the reminder of his previous life that he'd moved beyond, while the twins had become his real children, the ones worthy of his attention, investment, and love. The real warning signs started during Dad's 62nd birthday party. Victoria had planned an elaborate celebration at the country club, complete with a slideshow of family memories projected on a large screen. I watched in horror as photo after photo flashed by. Every image was from the past 3 years. Not a single picture included my mother, or showed Dad and me together from before Victoria's arrival. The slideshow told a story of a man who had been lost and alone until a beautiful woman and her children saved him, giving him a new purpose and a complete family. It was revisionist history at its most cruel and effective. When I mentioned this omission to Dad privately, he looked genuinely confused. "Victoria worked so hard on that presentation," he said, seeming almost offended that I'd criticized her effort. "She probably just focused on recent memories, the happy times we've shared as a family." But I noticed other changes too, changes that went beyond emotional manipulation into something much more frightening. Dad seemed more forgetful than simple aging would explain, often losing track of conversations mid-sentence. He'd started napping more frequently and seemed unusually tired after meals, sometimes falling asleep in his chair during family dinners. When I expressed concern about these symptoms, Victoria quickly explained that he was just working too hard and experiencing the normal effects of getting older. "The business has been incredibly stressful," she said, her voice full of loving concern. "I keep telling him to slow down and delegate more, but you know how stubborn men can be about admitting they need help." Victoria had also taken over managing Dad's medications after he had what she described as a minor heart episode during a family vacation. She counted out his pills each morning with military precision, claiming the doctors had said he was getting confused about dosages and needed supervision. "It's just precautionary," she assured me when I visited and noticed the elaborate pill organizer system she'd implemented. "The cardiologist wants someone monitoring his daily routine to make sure he doesn't accidentally double dose or skip medications." Dad, who had run a successful construction company for 25 years and managed complex projects involving millions of dollars and hundreds of workers with military precision, suddenly couldn't remember to take his heart medication properly. The contradiction was glaring, but every time I questioned it, Victoria had perfectly reasonable explanations backed up by medical documentation and concerned conversations with healthcare providers. "You're being paranoid," Dad would say when I suggested getting a second opinion or seeing his longtime physician. "Victoria's just looking out for me. She understands these medical things better than I do." The first real alarm bell rang on a Tuesday night when Dad called me at 3 a.m., his voice thick and disoriented in a way that made my stomach drop. "Where's your mother?" he asked, the confusion in his voice heartbreaking. "She was supposed to pick you up from school. I've been waiting for hours." "Dad, Mom died 8 years ago," I said gently. "I'm 20 years old. I live in my own apartment." There was a long silence, punctuated by the sound of Dad's labored breathing and what sounded like shuffling footsteps in the background. "I don't understand," he said finally. "Victoria said you were still in high school. She showed me your report card." Before I could respond, Victoria's voice came through the phone, crisp and authoritative. "Raymond, you're having another episode," she said. "Let me help you back to bed. You need your rest." The phone went dead, leaving me staring at my ceiling in the dark, my heart pounding with a terrible understanding of what was happening. When I called back the next morning, Victoria answered with her usual bright tone, explaining that Dad had been experiencing some confusion due to his new medication regimen. "The cardiologist had to adjust his prescriptions after his latest tests," she said, her voice full of medical authority. "Disorientation and memory issues are common side effects while his body adjusts to the new combinations." But when I researched Dad's supposed medications online, the combinations Victoria described didn't match any standard cardiac treatment protocols I could find. Some of the drugs she mentioned weren't even heart medications. They were sedatives and anti-anxiety medications that, when used together in high doses, could cause severe memory problems, confusion, and cognitive decline. I started keeping a detailed journal of Dad's behavior during my visits, documenting the times he seemed sharp and alert versus when he appeared foggy and disoriented. A clear pattern emerged. Dad was most confused in the evenings after dinner and most lucid in the early mornings before Victoria gave him his daily medications. During one visit, I arrived early in the morning before Victoria's usual medication routine. Dad was in the garden, pruning roses with steady hands and clear focus. When he saw me, his face lit up with genuine recognition and warmth. "There's my girl," he said, pulling me into a hug that felt like the father I remembered. "How's school going? Are you still planning to transfer to Northwestern?" For 20 minutes, we had a completely normal conversation. Dad asked about my classes, my job, my plans for the future. He seemed sharp, engaged, and completely himself. But then Victoria appeared with his morning pills and a glass of orange juice. "Time for your medication, honey," she said sweetly, watching carefully as Dad swallowed each pill. Within 30 minutes, the man I'd been talking to was gone, replaced by someone who seemed confused about who I was and why I was visiting. When I tried to discuss this pattern with Dad during one of his more lucid moments, he gripped my hand with surprising strength and glanced nervously toward the kitchen where Victoria was preparing his evening medications. "Something's wrong," he whispered, his voice filled with a desperation that broke my heart. "I can't think clearly anymore. Everything feels fuzzy, like I'm living underwater. Dad, maybe we should talk to a different doctor, get a second opinion." "She won't let me," he said quickly, his eyes darting toward the sound of Victoria's footsteps. "Victoria handles all my appointments now. She says I get too confused and give doctors wrong information about my symptoms." Before I could respond, Victoria returned with a glass of water and Dad's evening medications, her smile bright and loving. "Time for your pills, honey," she said, counting each one carefully into his palm and watching to make sure he swallowed them all. 20 minutes later, Dad was struggling to follow our conversation and seemed ready for bed, despite it being only 7 p.m. on a Saturday evening. That night, I called Dad's longtime physician, Dr. Morrison, who had been treating our family for over 15 years and had delivered me when I was born. "I'm concerned about my father's medication regimen," I said. "He seems confused and disoriented, especially in the evenings, and the symptoms seem to be getting worse." Dr. Morrison was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried a gravity that made my hands shake. "I haven't seen your father in over 8 months, he said finally. His wife transferred his care to a new practice last year. She said he wanted someone closer to home who specialized in geriatric medicine. "What new practice? Who's his doctor now?" "I'm not sure, Doctor," Morrison admitted. She didn't provide forwarding information, which was unusual. When I tried to send his medical records, the address she gave turned out to be incorrect. I spent the next week researching every cardiologist, geriatrician, and family practice in a 50-mile radius, calling each office to see if Dad was a patient. Nobody had him on file. Either Victoria was lying about his medical care completely, or she'd found a doctor willing to prescribe medications without proper oversight, which would be illegal and dangerous. The truth was worse than I could have imagined. I hired a private investigator named Derek Chen, a former police detective who specialized in elder abuse cases. What he discovered about Victoria's background made my blood run cold. Victoria hadn't just been married once before meeting Dad. She'd been married 4 times. 2 of her previous husbands had died under suspicious circumstances involving medication interactions and sudden health declines. One husband's family had filed a police report claiming Victoria had systematically poisoned him, but the case was dropped due to insufficient evidence and Victoria's convincing portrayal of herself as a grieving widow. The investigator also discovered that Victoria wasn't just managing Dad's medications. She was ordering them online from questionable pharmacies in other countries, using forged prescriptions and adjusting dosages without any medical supervision. The combinations she was giving Dad were not only inappropriate for his actual health conditions, they were potentially lethal if continued long-term. Even more damning, Derek found evidence that Victoria had been systematically stealing from Dad's business accounts, using her position as co-owner to redirect funds into accounts she controlled. She'd convinced Dad to sign financial documents by telling him they were routine business paperwork, but they were actually changing ownership structures and beneficiary designations. Armed with this information, I drove to Dad's house early one morning when Victoria was at her weekly yoga class. I found Dad in his workshop looking more alert than I'd seen him in months. "Dad, I need you to listen very carefully," I said, showing him Derek's report. "Victoria has been poisoning you." I expected shock, denial, even anger. What I didn't expect was the look of relief that crossed Dad's face. "I know," he said quietly. I stared at him in disbelief. "You know? Not poisoning exactly, but something," he said, his voice growing stronger and more focused than I'd heard in years. "The pills make me tired and confused, but I'm not stupid. I've been pretending to take them and hiding them instead." He led me to a small box hidden behind his workbench, filled with hundreds of pills in various colors and sizes. I started getting suspicious when I couldn't remember conversations from the day before, he continued. "So I began palming the pills during dinner and storing them here. I wanted to see if my symptoms improved when I stopped taking them." "Dad, why didn't you say something? Why didn't you call the police?" Dad's expression hardened with a determination I hadn't seen since before Victoria entered our lives. "Because I needed to understand what she was planning," he said. "And I needed evidence that would stick. Victoria's smart. She's done this before. I couldn't just accuse her of drugging me without proof that would hold up in court." He pulled out a larger box from under his workbench. Inside were notebooks filled with dates, times, and detailed observations about Victoria's behavior. Printed emails between Victoria and someone claiming to be Dr. Kowalski about adjusting Dad's treatment plan. Photos of Victoria crushing extra pills into Dad's food. Even receipts for medications ordered online without prescriptions. "I installed hidden cameras in the house 4 months ago," Dad said. "Everything's being recorded. Her preparing my food, counting out pills, researching medication interactions online. But Dad, why are you still living with her? Why haven't you called the police already?" Dad's expression turned cold and calculating. "Because I want her to think she's winning right up until the moment she loses everything." Over the next 2 hours, Dad explained his plan with the methodical precision of the successful businessman he'd always been. He'd been working with his longtime lawyer, Mr. Patterson, to build an airtight case against Victoria, while appearing to be under her complete control. He'd secretly updated his will, gathered evidence of her crimes, and arranged for everything to be revealed immediately after his death. "But Dad, what if she actually kills you? What if you miscalculate and she gives you too much of something?" "She won't," he said with absolute certainty. "Murder investigations involve autopsies and scrutiny. She's too smart for that. She's planning a longer game, keep me medicated and compliant until I'm completely dependent on her, then gradually increase dosages until my heart gives out from what appears to be natural causes. She figures she has another year or two to make it look completely natural. How can you be sure about her timeline? Dad showed me intercepted emails between Victoria and her sister, printed from her personal account that he'd gained access to by installing monitoring software on their shared computer. She wants to make sure the twins are established as my legal heirs first, he said, pointing to specific conversation. I'm supposed to adopt them officially, update all my insurance policies, and then die of apparent heart failure just after she's secured as the primary beneficiary of everything. The plan was diabolical in its patience and precision. Victoria wasn't just planning to kill Dad. She was methodically setting up a scenario where his death would appear natural, inevitable, and completely unrelated to her actions. So what's your plan? I asked. I'm going to give her exactly what she thinks she wants, Dad said with a grim smile, and then I'm going to take it all away. Dad's counter strategy was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its completeness. He would continue pretending to be under Victoria's influence while secretly documenting everything she did. When his apparent health declined enough to require hospitalization, which Victoria was actively working toward, he would make sure all the evidence was ready for immediate release. She thinks she's slowly killing me, Dad explained, but really, I'm building the case that's going to destroy her completely. The next few months were agonizing for me. I had to watch Victoria continue her charade of loving care, while knowing exactly what she was doing. Dad continued to appear confused and dependent, but our secret communications kept me informed of his real condition and the evidence he was gathering. He'd figured out how to fake taking his medications while secretly filming Victoria's attempts to increase his dosages. He'd discovered that she was also putting additional drugs in his food, sedatives that would make him more compliant and eventually lead to heart failure when combined with the medications she was supposedly giving him. The most damning evidence came when Dad installed a hidden camera in Victoria's home office. We watched her research his life insurance policies, calculate inheritance timelines, and even practice her grieving widow routine in the mirror. In one particularly chilling recording, she was on the phone with someone discussing the best way to increase Dad's medication without raising medical suspicion. The heart condition gives us perfect cover, she said, checking notes she'd made about drug interactions. A little extra stress, some medication conflicts, and it'll look completely natural. No one questions a heart attack in a man his age. Dad also discovered that Victoria had been forging his signature on financial documents for over a year, gradually transferring assets into accounts she controlled. She'd convinced him to sign papers by telling him they were routine business documents or insurance updates, but they were actually changing beneficiaries and ownership structures throughout his entire financial portfolio. She's been planning this for over 3 years, Dad told me during one of our secret meetings at a coffee shop across town. Every document, every conversation, every medication, it's all been building toward the moment when I die, and she inherits everything. The final piece of evidence came when Dad hired a forensic accountant to trace all the financial transfers Victoria had orchestrated. The theft was systematic and extensive. She'd stolen over $400,000 from his business accounts and redirected his investment income into funds she managed. As Dad's apparent health declined, Victoria's behavior became more brazen and confident. She started making concrete plans for after his death, including renovations to the house, arrangements for the twins' ongoing education expenses, and even discussions with a travel agent about the European vacation she planned to take when she was a wealthy widow. Poor Raymond is struggling so much, she'd tell friends and neighbors. The doctor says his heart is failing faster than we hoped. It's just a matter of time now. What she didn't know was that Dad had been secretly recording these conversations and sharing them with his lawyer and the private investigator. The day Dad was hospitalized with severe chest pains, which Victoria had induced by significantly increasing his medication dosage and adding a dangerous drug interaction, everything was already in motion. Patterson had copies of all evidence. Law enforcement had been briefed, and a completely revised will had been filed that excluded Victoria and her children entirely. Dad died 3 days later, apparently from heart failure brought on by medication complications. Victoria's performance at the hospital was worthy of an Academy Award. The devastated wife who'd done everything possible to save her beloved husband. But Dad had planned for this too. Hidden cameras in his hospital room captured Victoria's moments of unguarded satisfaction when she thought no one was watching. In one particularly revealing moment, she was caught smiling while texting someone about finally being free to live the life she deserved. At the funeral, Victoria orchestrated every detail to present herself as the grieving widow and devoted stepmother. She wore designer black that she'd purchased weeks earlier, as if she'd been preparing for this moment. Her tears seemed genuine to most observers, but I noticed how she checked her phone constantly, and how her grief seemed to lift whenever she thought no one was looking. Ethan and Zoe flanked her like bodyguards, already discussing their inheritance and making plans for their share of Dad's estate. They'd been told by Victoria that Dad had left everything to their family, with only a small keepsake set aside for his biological daughter. I can't believe he's gone, Victoria sobbed to the assembled guests, her voice carrying just the right amount of heartbreak. But I know Raymond would want us to carry on his legacy and honor everything he worked so hard to build. During the service, Victoria delivered a heartfelt eulogy about Dad's generosity and love for family, describing how he'd embraced her children as his own, and how excited he'd been about their future together. Raymond always said that family isn't just about blood, she said, looking directly at me with what appeared to be compassion but felt like victory. It's about the people who choose to love and support each other through everything life brings. The implication was clear. I had failed to be that kind of family member, while Victoria and her children had earned their place as Dad's true family. I sat in the back row during the service, watching this performance with a mixture of grief from my father and anticipation for what was coming next. Nobody had saved me a seat with the family, but that was perfectly fine. I had a better view of everyone's faces from back there. After the burial, everyone gathered at Dad's house, which Victoria had already begun referring to as her house. She'd started rearranging furniture that morning, moving Dad's favorite reading chair to make room for a bar setup, where guests could gather and share memories. The will reading is just a formality, I heard her whisper to her sister while they arranged flowers. Raymond left everything to me and the kids. The poor thing will probably get some small keepsake to remember him by. Victoria was already making concrete plans for her new life. She'd secretly hired an interior designer to completely renovate the house, including turning Dad's workshop into a yoga studio and converting the garage into a guest suite for when her mother visited. She'd also been in contact with a realtor about the possibility of selling the house and moving somewhere more luxurious. Zoe was discussing her room renovation plans with the designer Victoria had brought to the reception, talking about converting Dad's office into her personal study space. Ethan was researching which of Dad's classic cars he wanted to sell first to fund his spring break trip to Europe and a new apartment near his university. Victoria spent most of the reception on the phone with her financial advisor, discussing how quickly she could access Dad's accounts and whether she needed to maintain his construction business or could liquidate it immediately for maximum profit. The construction company will be worth more if we sell the assets separately, she said, not bothering to lower her voice since she assumed everyone supported her plans. The equipment alone should bring in a substantial amount. That's when Mr. Patterson arrived with his briefcase and a solemn expression that immediately caught Victoria's attention. He looked like he was carrying bad news, which made Victoria's confident smile falter for just a moment before she recovered her composure. "I'm so sorry for your loss," he said, setting up his materials at the dining room table with the gravity of someone about to deliver life-changing information. "Raymond asked me to read his will immediately after the service." Victoria smoothed her expensive black dress and took her position at the head of the table, the spot she'd been planning to claim as the new matriarch of the family. Ethan and Zoe flanked her like loyal lieutenants, barely containing their excitement about learning the details of their inheritance. I remained standing by the kitchen doorway, exactly where Dad had instructed me to position myself months earlier. "Should we wait for other family members?" Mr. Patterson asked politely, glancing around the room. "This is the family," Victoria said firmly, her voice carrying the authority of someone who believed she was about to inherit everything. "Raymond's daughter chose not to be part of our lives. She's here out of obligation, not love." I said nothing, just as Dad had instructed me to do. My time to speak would come soon enough. "Very well," Mr. Patterson said, opening his briefcase with deliberate precision. The last will and testament of Raymond Blackwood, dated 6 months ago and witnessed by 3 independent parties. Victoria's smile grew wider with anticipation. She'd been waiting for this moment for over 3 years. "To my wife Victoria, I leave my gratitude for showing me who she really was." Her smile faltered slightly, but she quickly recovered. This was probably just Dad's dramatic way of expressing his love before getting to the substantial bequests. "To her children, Ethan and Zoe, I leave the same. My gratitude for revealing their true character and intentions." Now Ethan looked confused, glancing at his mother for reassurance that this was normal legal language that would make sense soon. "To my daughter, who remained loyal even when I appeared to abandon her, I leave everything: the house, all bank accounts, all investments, the construction business, and all personal property." Victoria shot up from her chair like she'd been electrocuted, her face transforming from confident satisfaction to pure shock in an instant. "That's impossible," she said, her voice shaking with disbelief and rage. "We discussed this extensively. Raymond promised me everything would be left to our family." Mr. Patterson held up his hand with calm authority. "There's more, Mrs. Blackwood. To the appropriate authorities, I leave comprehensive evidence of fraud, elder abuse, systematic medication tampering, and attempted murder. This evidence has been compiled over the past 6 months and includes video recordings, financial records, medical documentation, and detailed witness statements." The room went completely silent except for the sound of Victoria's increasingly labored breathing and Zoe's sharp gasp of shock. Additionally, Mr. Patterson continued with the methodical precision of someone who'd prepared for this moment, "Raymond specifically requested that this evidence be presented to law enforcement immediately following the reading of his will." Victoria's face had gone completely white, then flushed red with rage and panic. "This is absolutely ridiculous," she stammered, looking around the room for support. Raymond was confused and paranoid at the end. The medications made him suspicious of everyone who tried to help him. He didn't know what he was saying. "On the contrary," Mr. Patterson said, pulling out a thick folder filled with documentation. "Raymond had 3 separate psychological evaluations over the past 6 months, all conducted by independent professionals, and all confirming his complete mental competency. He also had independent medical evaluations confirming that the medications he was supposedly prescribed would have been fatal in the combinations and dosages you were administering." Victoria's carefully constructed mask finally slipped completely, revealing the cold calculation underneath. "You can't prove anything," she hissed, no longer bothering to maintain her grieving widow act. Mr. Patterson pulled out a tablet computer and pressed play. Victoria's face appeared on the screen, clearly visible as she crushed additional pills into Dad's evening soup while he napped in his recliner. "You poisoned him," I said quietly, speaking for the first time since the reading began. The room erupted into chaos. Ethan and Zoe started shouting questions at their mother. Victoria's sister began crying and demanding explanations. The remaining funeral guests stood in stunned silence, processing the revelation that they'd been attending the funeral of a murder victim. "The next video shows Mrs. Blackwood researching lethal drug combinations on her computer," Mr. Patterson continued with professional calm. And here she is practicing her widow performance in the mirror, including the specific phrases she planned to use when discussing Raymond's death. Victoria lunged for the tablet, but Mr. Patterson was expecting the reaction and smoothly moved it out of her reach. "These are copies," he said. "The original evidence is already with the district attorney's office." "I want a lawyer," Victoria said, her voice now completely cold and calculating, all pretense of grief abandoned. "That's certainly your right," said Detective Martinez, who had just walked through the front door with two uniformed officers. "Victoria Mills, you're under arrest for elder abuse, financial fraud, and attempted murder." As they read her rights, Victoria turned on me with pure, undiluted hatred. "This should have been mine," she screamed as they handcuffed her, her voice carrying years of resentment and entitlement. "He was nothing before I came along. Nothing. A broken man grieving his dead wife. I gave him purpose. I gave him a family. I gave him a reason to live. And you're just a jealous little bitch who couldn't stand that he loved me more than you." "No," I said calmly, meeting her furious gaze without flinching. "He never loved you at all. He was just gathering evidence to destroy you." The officers had to physically drag her out as she continued screaming about how the evidence was fabricated and how I'd manipulated a sick old man against his loving wife. Ethan and Zoe sat in stunned silence as Detective Martinez explained that they might face charges for benefiting from their mother's crimes, depending on what they knew and when they learned it. "We really didn't know," Zoe whispered, tears streaming down her face. "We thought she just helped him organize his pills and manage his schedule." "And the money she was spending on your education and expenses?" Detective Martinez asked. "She told us Dad wanted to help with our future," Ethan said, his voice barely audible. "She said he loved us like his own children and wanted to make sure we had every opportunity." The detective nodded. "We'll need formal statements from both of you. Depending on what our investigation reveals about your knowledge and involvement, you may or may not face charges." After the police left with Victoria, the remaining guests slowly departed, leaving me alone with Ethan and Zoe. They looked young and lost. Nothing like the confident teenagers who'd been planning their inheritance just hours earlier. "The house is mine now," I said, not unkindly, but firmly. "You have until the end of the month to figure out where you're going." "We understand," Ethan said quietly, "and we're sorry about everything. We never meant for anyone to get hurt." "Your mother systematically poisoned my father for 3 years," I replied. "Whether you meant for it to happen doesn't change what did happen." That night, I sat in Dad's workshop with his hidden notebook, reading the final entries he'd made before entering the hospital for the last time. On the last page, he'd written a letter to me in his careful handwriting. "Kiddo, if you're reading this, then justice worked exactly the way it was supposed to. I know I wasn't the father you deserved these past few years. I had to let Victoria think she was winning so I could gather enough evidence to destroy her completely. I know it looked like I'd forgotten about you, like I'd chosen her family over my own daughter, but everything I did was to protect what matters most, you and the truth about what kind of person your mother really was. Victoria tried to erase your mom from our lives, but love isn't that easy to kill. Your mother's strength lives in you, and that's what made it possible for me to be strong enough to fight back. The house is yours, the business is yours, but more importantly, you have your freedom and your future back. Use them well. I'm proud of the woman you've become, even when I couldn't show it. Love always, Dad." I cried for the first time since he died, finally understanding that he'd never abandoned me at all. Every cold interaction, every moment when he seemed to choose Victoria's family over mine, had been part of a larger plan to protect me and expose her. The trial took 10 months and became a sensation in our community. Victoria was convicted on all charges after the overwhelming evidence was presented to the jury. The prosecution called it one of the most calculated and cold-blooded cases of elder abuse they'd ever seen. The defendant systematically isolated, poisoned, and robbed a man who trusted her completely, the judge said during sentencing. The premeditation and cruelty involved, combined with evidence of similar behavior in previous relationships, warrant the maximum penalty available under law. Victoria was sentenced to 25 years in prison without the possibility of parole. She showed no remorse throughout the trial, maintaining her innocence and insisting that she'd been trying to help Dad manage his medical conditions. Ethan and Zoe were not charged after cooperating fully with the investigation and testifying about their mother's manipulation. They both described how Victoria had controlled their access to Dad and fed them false information about his wishes and feelings. "We thought he really wanted to adopt us," Zoe testified, tears streaming down her face. "Mom said he was just waiting for the right legal moment to make it official." The twins moved in with their aunt in another state after the trial. They both reached out to apologize once they fully understood the extent of what Victoria had done. "We know it doesn't change anything," Ethan wrote in a letter 6 months after the trial. "But we want you to know that we never knew about the poisoning or the financial theft. If we had known, we would have called the police immediately. I kept Dad's house but sold the construction business to his longtime foreman, who'd always been loyal to our family and understood Dad's vision for the company. With the money from the sale, I finished my degree at Northwestern, the school Mom and I had always dreamed about, and started a nonprofit organization focused on identifying and preventing elder abuse. Our first case involved an 80-year-old man whose live-in caregiver was systematically stealing his Social Security payments and selling his medications. Our second case exposed a nursing home that was over-medicating residents to keep them compliant and manageable. By the end of our first year, we'd helped prosecute 12 cases of elder abuse and recovered over $500,000 in stolen assets for victims and their families. Dad would have been proud of what grew out of his sacrifice and planning. On the first anniversary of Dad's death, I visited his grave and told him about the lives we'd saved. I brought photos of the families we'd helped and read him thank you letters from people who'd escaped situations similar to what he'd endured. We saved Mrs. Chen from a daughter-in-law who was forging her Social Security checks and isolating her from other family members. I told his headstone. And Mr. Rodriguez's nephew was stealing his prescription medications to sell on the street while giving him sugar pills instead. The evidence-gathering techniques you taught me helped convict them both. Sometimes people ask if I feel guilty about the elaborate trap Dad set for Victoria or whether I think his methods were extreme. The answer is simple. I don't feel guilty about anything. Dad chose to sacrifice 3 years of his life and risk his health to gather irrefutable evidence against a woman who would have killed him and stolen everything he'd worked for. Victoria still writes me letters from prison, claiming she was framed and that Dad was mentally ill. She insists that she loved him genuinely and was only trying to help manage his medical care according to doctor's orders. I don't read her letters anymore. The last communication I received from her was through her lawyer, offering to provide information about her previous husband's deaths in exchange for a reduced sentence. The FBI is investigating those cases now, and preliminary evidence suggests that at least 2 other men died under suspicious circumstances while married to Victoria. I've learned that some people are poison in human form, and the only way to protect yourself and others is to document everything meticulously and trust the justice system to work the way it's supposed to when given sufficient evidence. The house feels peaceful now. I've restored it to the way it looked when Mom was alive, with her favorite colors and the family photos Victoria tried to erase. Dad's workshop has become a memorial space where I keep his evidence notebooks and the awards our nonprofit has received for helping elder abuse victims. On quiet evenings, I sit in Mom's reading chair and imagine her and Dad together, finally at peace, knowing that truth and love won in the end against calculation and greed. And sometimes when I'm working on a difficult case involving elder abuse, I can almost hear Dad's voice guiding me through the process of gathering evidence and building an unbreakable case for justice. Victoria thought she could erase our family history and rewrite our story with herself as the hero. Instead, she revealed her true nature and gave Dad exactly the evidence he needed to make sure she could never hurt anyone else. The best revenge isn't just letting the truth speak for itself, it's making sure that truth protects other people from experiencing the same kind of calculated evil. Justice isn't always immediate, but when it comes, it's devastating and complete.
I recorded my family's reaction when they thought I died, and now I can never look at them the same way. It started as a stupid prank idea that spiraled into something that destroyed my entire world. The kind of impulsive decision that seems brilliant at 19, but reveals itself as monumentally stupid once the consequences start rolling in. I was home from college for winter break, feeling like a ghost in my own house. My older brother Declan had just gotten engaged to his perfect girlfriend Vanessa, a dental hygienist with a trust fund, and the kind of laugh that made everyone turn around. They spent every dinner discussing wedding venues while Mom took notes like she was planning a military operation. My younger sister Bryn was the family golden child. Honor roll since kindergarten, varsity soccer captain, already accepted to 3 Ivy League schools as a junior. She had this way of making everything look effortless: straight A's, athletic scholarships, volunteer work at the animal shelter. Meanwhile, I was the middle kid who'd barely scraped through freshman year with a 2.1 GPA. I'd switched majors 3 times, lost my academic scholarship, and was considering dropping out to work at my roommate's uncle's auto shop. Every conversation with my parents ended with them asking what my plan was. At dinner, they'd forgotten my birthday. Again. It was December 18th, my 20th birthday, and nobody mentioned it. Dad was going on about Declan's promotion at the marketing firm. Mom was showing neighbor photos of Bryn's latest academic award ceremony. I sat there eating meatloaf, completely invisible. When I tried to mention that my sociology professor had complimented my final essay, Dad just nodded and asked Declan about his year-end bonus. That's when I remembered the old storm drain tunnel that ran under our neighborhood. As kids, we dared each other to crawl through it, but it was considered too dangerous after some kid supposedly got trapped during a flash flood years ago. The plan formed in my head: disappear for a few hours, leave some evidence by the tunnel entrance, let them think something terrible happened. I'd hide in the abandoned barn behind the Thompsons' property, where I'd already stashed supplies, just long enough to see if they'd actually care that I was gone. I planted my favorite shoes and torn jacket by the tunnel opening during their Friday night game night, made sure my phone would ping one last location there before shutting off. Then I hiked to my hiding spot with a spare phone I'd bought with cash. But here's the thing about thinking you're smart at 19. You're usually just spectacularly stupid. I'd hidden a tiny voice recorder in the living room bookshelf weeks earlier when I suspected Mom of reading my diary. I'd planned to catch her snooping, but forgot about it until now. The battery could record for 12 hours straight. From the barn, I called 911 from the burner phone, disguising my voice to report someone screaming from the tunnel area. Then I waited for my family to notice I was missing and panic. It took them 6 hours, 6 whole hours before anyone realized I wasn't in my room. When the police knocked at 2 a.m., I watched through binoculars as my family stumbled to the door in their pajamas. The officer explained they'd found evidence of someone potentially trapped in the storm drain system. Search and rescue was being called. I expected immediate hysteria, tears streaming down Mom's face, Dad collapsing with worry, the kind of dramatic grief you see in movies. Instead, I watched Dad nod calmly and invite the officer inside for coffee. The recorder captured everything they said next. "How long has your son been missing?" Officer Martinez asked, settling into our kitchen chair like this was a routine wellness check. I could hear the scraping of chair legs against our hardwood floor, the familiar creak of our old house settling around them. "We're honestly not sure," Mom said, her voice carrying that particular tone she used when talking to teachers about my poor grades, patient but slightly exasperated. "He's been difficult lately. We thought he was just hiding in his room being moody like he usually does." The word difficult hit me like a slap. I was struggling with depression, feeling invisible in my own family, but to them I was just difficult, a problem to be managed rather than a person to be understood. Has he displayed any concerning behaviors recently? Officer Martinez continued, and I could hear him flipping through pages in his notebook. Any talk of self-harm or running away? Not directly, Dad replied, and I could picture him leaning back in his chair the way he did during serious conversations. But he's been very dramatic lately, always looking for attention since he was little. You know how some kids just have that personality. Everything's a crisis, everything's the end of the world. My stomach twisted hearing him reduce my genuine emotional struggles to attention-seeking behavior. Every time I tried to talk to them about feeling overwhelmed or lost, they dismissed it as dramatics. What about his academic performance? The officer asked. Sometimes school stress can contribute to these situations. He's failing out of college, Declan interjected, and I could hear him moving around the kitchen, probably making himself a sandwich like this was just another late-night conversation. Got kicked off academic probation this semester. Been talking about dropping out completely. That must be stressful for the whole family, Officer Martinez said diplomatically. It is, Mom agreed, sighing heavily. We've invested so much money in his education, and he just doesn't seem to care. $43,000 a year, and he's treating it like a joke. The way she said it made my college struggles sound like a personal attack on the family finances, rather than a young person trying to figure out their path in life. I have to ask a difficult question, Officer Martinez continued, his voice becoming more serious. Based on his recent behavior and statements, is there any reason to believe he might harm himself? The silence that followed felt eternal. I held my breath, waiting for them to immediately defend me, to say I'd never expressed suicidal thoughts, to explain that I was just going through a rough patch like millions of college students. Honestly, Mom's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. We've been worried about his mental state for months. He's been increasingly unstable since he got home from school, sleeping all day, staying up all night, hardly eating meals with the family. Unstable. The word echoed in my head like a death sentence. My irregular sleep schedule and loss of appetite, classic signs of depression, were being reframed as evidence of mental instability. He failed most of his classes this semester, Declan added, and I could hear him chewing, actually eating while discussing my potential suicide. Came home talking about how everyone was better off without him, really concerning stuff about not being good enough for this family. That was a complete fabrication. I had never said anyone was better off without me. I'd mentioned feeling like I didn't fit in, like I couldn't live up to their expectations, but never anything that dramatic. We tried getting him counseling last year, Mom continued, her voice gaining momentum as she built her case. But he refused to continue after the first few sessions, said the therapist didn't understand him and was asking stupid questions. That was partially true, but missing crucial context. Dr. Hendricks had spent our sessions asking about childhood trauma and family dysfunction, when what I really needed was help with time management and academic anxiety. When I'd asked my parents if we could try a different therapist who specialized in college transition issues, they'd said counseling was too expensive and I needed to make it work with Dr. Hendricks. Has he ever exhibited violent tendencies? Officer Martinez asked. Toward himself or others? Not violent exactly, Dad said carefully. But he has a temper. Slammed his bedroom door so hard last week that he cracked the frame. Punched a hole in his wall last month when we told him he couldn't go on spring break with his friends because of his grades. I had slammed my door once after they'd screamed at me for an hour about my GPA, and the hole in my wall happened when I'd been having a panic attack about an exam and needed a physical outlet for the overwhelming anxiety. But they made it sound like I was regularly violent and destructive. The questions continued for another 20 minutes. Officer Martinez asked about my friends, my hobbies, any signs of drug or alcohol use. My family answered like they were discussing a troubled neighbor rather than their son and brother. Every response was clinical, detached, focused on my problems rather than my humanity. They mentioned that I'd been moody since middle school, challenging since high school, and increasingly concerning since starting college. They painted a picture of a young man spiraling toward inevitable self-destruction, someone they'd been watching with growing worry and dread. But what struck me most was how prepared they sounded, like they'd been rehearsing these answers, thinking through these scenarios. Like my potential death was something they'd already considered and discussed. We've honestly been walking on eggshells around him, Mom said toward the end of the interview. Never knowing what might set him off or send him into one of his episodes, it's been affecting the whole family dynamic. Episodes, like I was mentally ill rather than just struggling. Officer Martinez's radio crackled with updates from the search team. Through my binoculars, I could see more emergency vehicles arriving, their red and blue lights painting our suburban street in urgent colors. Real people were risking their lives crawling through dangerous underground tunnels because of my stupid prank. We'll need to search his room, Officer Martinez said. Sometimes we can find clues about his state of mind or intentions. Of course, Dad said immediately. Whatever you need. I watched them lead the officer upstairs, their footsteps heavy on the wooden stairs I'd climbed thousands of times as a child. They were about to rifle through my private space, looking for evidence of suicidal ideation or plans to run away. The recorder continued capturing their conversation as they returned to the kitchen. Poor officer, Mom said once they were alone again. Having to deal with this kind of thing on a Friday night. At least they're taking it seriously, Declan replied, even though we all know what probably happened. What do you mean? Bryn asked. She'd been quiet during most of the police interview, probably scared and confused about everything happening. Come on, Bryn, Declan said, his voice gentle but certain. You've seen how he's been acting. The mood swings, The isolation, the talk about not being good enough. This was probably inevitable. My sister made a small sound that might have been a sob. You think he hurt himself? I think he's been crying for help for months, Mom said, her voice taking on that patient, explaining tone she used with children. And we tried to help him, but you can't save someone who doesn't want to be saved. The casual certainty in her voice chilled me. She wasn't just speculating about my death, she was explaining it, rationalizing it, making peace with it. Should we call Aunt Patricia and Uncle Rob? Bryn asked through tears. They should know what's happening. Not yet, Dad said quickly. Let's see what the search turns up first. No point worrying the whole extended family until we know something concrete. I mean, Mom said slowly, and there was something different in her tone that made my blood freeze, something calculating. Maybe this is for the best. The silence that followed was deafening. Even through the recording, I could feel the weight of those words settling over the kitchen like a dark cloud. What do you mean? Declan asked, and even he sounded uncertain about where this conversation was heading. Think about it logically, Mom continued, her voice gaining confidence as she organized her thoughts. He's been nothing but problems since middle school. The therapy bills alone have cost us thousands of dollars over the years. Now he's flunking out of the college we're paying $43,000 a year for. Mom, Bryn started, but her voice was weak, overwhelmed. I'm just saying, honey, we've done everything we possibly could for him. We got him tutors when he struggled in high school. We paid for SAT prep courses. We got him counseling when he seemed depressed. We tried medication for his ADHD. She paused, and I could hear her moving around the kitchen, probably putting away dishes or wiping down counters like she always did when thinking through problems. Nothing worked. He's resistant to every form of help we try to give him. The kid's just broken, Dad said bluntly. Some people are born with something wrong in their heads. We could spend another $100,000 on college and therapy, and he'd still end up working at a gas station somewhere. Broken. The word hit me harder than any physical blow could have. My own father thought I was fundamentally, irreparably broken. If something happened tonight, Mom continued carefully, maybe it's a blessing in disguise, a mercy even. Jesus, Mom, Declan said, but he didn't sound horrified. He sounded tired, like this was a conversation they'd had before. That's pretty cold, even for you. I know how that sounds, she said quickly, defensively, but think about the stress it would relieve for everyone. No more fighting about his grades every semester. No more worrying about what kind of trouble he'll get into next. No more walking on eggshells around his moods and outbursts. The life insurance policy, Dad said quietly, and my world completely shattered. It's still active until he turns 21. We're paying premiums on a $150,000 policy through my work. They were calculating my monetary value. Sitting in our kitchen at 3 a.m., with search teams risking their lives to find my body, my parents were discussing how much money my death would bring them. That would cover Bryn's college completely, Mom said, and I could hear papers rustling like she was actually doing math. Stanford's expensive, but this would handle 4 years plus graduate school if she wants it. Full tuition, room and board, everything. And there'd be enough left over to help with Declan's wedding, Dad added. Maybe the down payment on a house, too. Vanessa's been looking at those new developments in Riverside. They were talking about my death like a financial windfall. Like my life insurance was a better investment than my actual life. I know it sounds horrible to think about money at a time like this, Mom continued, her voice becoming more animated as she warmed to the topic. But we have to be practical. We've already spent so much on him. Therapy, tutoring, college tuition, his car, his living expenses. At least this way, some good could come from all this tragedy. He's been sucking up family resources for years, Dad agreed. Every dollar we spend on his problems is a dollar we can't invest in Bryn's future or Declan's success. Kid's like a financial black hole. Maybe some people are just meant to struggle, Mom said philosophically. Maybe this is natural selection working itself out. He's never been able to adapt to normal social expectations or academic standards. I listened to my family, the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally, discussing how my death would improve their lives financially and emotionally. They talked about me like I was a bad investment that had finally reached maturity, a problem that had solved itself through elimination. We should probably think about how to handle this with the community, Declan said after a long pause. People will expect us to be devastated. There'll be sympathy casseroles and memorial services and all that. Of course we'll be appropriately upset, Mom said, like she was planning a dinner party. He was our son. We loved him despite his problems. Loved. Past tense. I was already dead to them. We'll need to plan some kind of memorial service, she continued. Nothing too elaborate given the circumstances. Maybe just a small gathering at the church with Pastor Williams. What about a scholarship fund? Dad suggested. Something for troubled kids or mental health awareness. It would look good, and maybe help with the tax situation. They spent the next hour discussing the logistics of my death like event planners, how to handle media attention if the story gained traction, whether to set up a GoFundMe for other families dealing with mental health crises, what kind of photo to use for newspaper obituaries, something recent that showed how troubled I'd become, or an older picture from when I still looked happy. We should probably get rid of his stuff fairly quickly, Mom said practically. Keeping a shrine isn't healthy for anyone, and we could use his room for other purposes. Salvation Army? Dad agreed. Most of it's junk anyway. The electronics might have some value, but his clothes are all wrong sizes for anyone in the family. I want to keep some things, Bryn said quietly. It was the first time she'd spoken in over an hour. Some of his books, maybe. Or his guitar. Of course, sweetheart, Mom said in that indulgent tone she used when humoring children. You can pick out a few mementos, but we can't keep everything. It's not healthy to live in the past. The search continued for 3 agonizing days, and I documented every moment through my binoculars and the ongoing recordings from devices I'd planted throughout the house. Watching my family perform grief while planning my estate was like watching a play where I was the only one who knew the actors were just reciting lines. During the day, when news cameras were rolling and neighbors were watching, they played their parts perfectly. Mom dabbed at her eyes with tissues that never seemed to run out. Dad spoke to reporters about hoping for a miracle while keeping one strong, protective arm around Bryn. Declan fielded phone calls from relatives and college friends, his voice heavy with appropriate sorrow. They looked exactly like the devastated family everyone expected to see. The community rallied around them with an outpouring of support that was both heartwarming and heartbreaking. Neighbors organized meal trains. The church set up a prayer circle. Local businesses donated money to support the search efforts. But at night, when the cameras packed up and the volunteers went home, I heard them through my hidden recorders planning their next moves with the cold efficiency of a corporate boardroom. Channel 8 wants to do a follow-up interview tomorrow, Dad reported during their second night of grief. Something about the dangers of mental health issues in college students. Perfect, Mom replied. We should emphasize how we tried to get him help, but he resisted treatment. Really drive home that some kids just can't be saved despite their parents' best efforts. Should I mention the insurance policy? Dad asked. Sometimes these stories generate donations. Too soon, Declan advised. Let people offer first. We don't want to look opportunistic. They discussed which photos to release to the media, what details about my mental health to share publicly, and how to frame my disappearance in a way that generated maximum sympathy without making them look negligent. We need to be careful about the timeline, Mom said. If people start asking why we didn't notice he was missing for 6 hours, it might look bad. We were all asleep, Dad said firmly. It was the middle of the night. Normal families don't check on their adult children every hour. But I knew the truth. They hadn't checked on me because they didn't think about me. I was invisible in my own home, a background presence they noticed only when I was causing problems. The search teams worked 18-hour shifts following every lead, checking every branch of the tunnel system that snaked beneath our suburban neighborhood. I watched grown men and women emerge from those underground passages covered in mud and exhaustion, still determined to find any trace of me. Captain Rodriguez, the fire chief coordinating the rescue efforts, held daily press conferences updating the community on their progress. His voice grew more hoarse with each briefing, his eyes more red-rimmed from lack of sleep. We're not giving up, he said on day 3, his voice cracking slightly. Every family deserves closure. Every child deserves to come home. Meanwhile, my actual family was at home discussing whether to donate my computer to charity or sell it online for extra money. The laptop's only 2 years old, Dad mentioned during their third night of freedom from my presence. Probably worth $600 or $700. eBay, Declan suggested. Better prices than the pawn shops. They'd also started cleaning out my room, sorting through my belongings like vultures picking over a carcass. Through my bedroom window recorder, I heard them rifling through my drawers, making piles of what to keep, sell, or throw away. This diary might be important, Mom said, and I realized she'd found my old journal from high school. The police might want to see it for clues about his mental state. What's it say? Bryn asked. Typical teenager stuff, Mom replied dismissively. Complaining about feeling misunderstood, rambling about his future, some poetry that doesn't make much sense. She was reading my most private thoughts aloud like a grocery list, looking for evidence to support their narrative of my instability. Those journal entries represented years of genuine emotion and self-reflection, but to her they were just more proof that I was troubled. On day 3, they officially called off the search. My body was presumed lost in the underground water system that connected to the Riverside Creek. The current was too strong during winter months, the passages too unstable for continued rescue efforts. Captain Rodriguez made the announcement with tears in his eyes. We've exhausted all possible search areas. I'm sorry we couldn't bring him home. That evening, I watched through my binoculars as our house filled with neighbors, church members, and family friends offering condolences and support. They brought enough casseroles and baked goods to feed an army. People hugged my parents, whispered words of comfort, and promised to keep our family in their prayers. My family accepted these gestures with appropriate gratitude and sorrow. They nodded sadly, thanked everyone for their kindness, and spoke about how much the community support meant during this difficult time. But after the last visitor left, I heard Dad open a beer and Mom run a bath. The sounds of relief were unmistakable. The performance was over, and they could finally relax. Thank God that's done with, Mom said, her voice echoing from the bathroom. I don't think I could have kept up the grieving mother act much longer. The whole thing was exhausting, Dad agreed. All those people expecting us to be emotional wrecks, like we're supposed to fall apart just because he finally did something we all saw coming. That night, while they were at a late dinner with Pastor Williams supposedly planning my memorial service, I crept back into the house through the basement window I'd left unlocked. My childhood home felt like a foreign country now, every familiar surface and smell tainted by what I'd learned about my family's true feelings. I moved through the house like a ghost, gathering the recorders and a few personal items I couldn't bear to leave behind. My hands shook as I packed a duffel bag with clothes, my laptop, and the small amount of cash I'd saved from my work-study job. Before leaving, I sat at my old desk and wrote a note on my favorite stationery, the paper Bryn had given me for my 18th birthday. Found out what you really think of me. Goodbye forever. I left it on my pillow, knowing they'd find it when they came to finish cleaning out my room. Let them wonder if I'd been alive the whole time. Let them question every conversation they'd had about my death benefits and their relief at my disappearance. By dawn, I was on a Greyhound bus to Portland, Oregon, with $300 in cash, a duffel bag of clothes, and a phone full of recordings that proved my family saw me as a financial burden rather than a human being worthy of love. I'd chosen Portland because it was far enough away to disappear completely, but large enough to find work without too many questions. Plus, Oregon had a reputation for accepting misfits and people starting over, which felt appropriate for someone who'd literally faked their own death to escape their family. The bus ride took 36 hours with stops in Chicago, Denver, and Salt Lake City. I spent most of the journey staring out windows at landscapes I'd never seen, feeling simultaneously terrified and liberated. For the first time in my life, nobody knew where I was or what I was supposed to be doing. The freedom was intoxicating and overwhelming. In Portland, I rented a tiny studio apartment in a converted warehouse in the industrial district. The building was full of artists, musicians, and other people who seemed to be running from something or towards something. Nobody asked intrusive questions about my background or why a 19-year-old was living alone so far from home. I found work at a shipping warehouse, loading trucks and managing inventory. The job was physical and mindless, exactly what I needed while processing the emotional trauma of learning my family would profit from my death. My supervisor, Miguel, was a 40-year-old former Marine who treated everyone with respect and saw potential in people others had written off. "You're smart," he told me after my first month. "I can tell. You don't have to load boxes forever if you don't want to." He was right. Once I started paying attention, I discovered I had a natural talent for logistics and organization. I could see patterns in shipping routes, anticipate inventory needs, and streamline processes that had been inefficient for years. Within 6 months, I was promoted to assistant warehouse manager. For the first time in my life, I was succeeding at something without constant criticism or disappointment. Miguel and my coworkers praised my initiative and reliability. They appreciated my contributions instead of focusing on my failures. I also started taking night classes at Portland Community College, working toward my GED and eventually a degree in supply chain management. The smaller class sizes and supportive atmosphere were completely different from the overwhelming pressure I'd felt at my expensive 4-year university. But the healing process wasn't linear. Some nights I'd wake up in a cold sweat, hearing my mother's voice saying, "Maybe this is for the best." Other times I'd catch myself planning what I'd say if I ever saw them again, imagining confrontations that would never happen. I started seeing a counselor at the community college, Dr. Sarah Chen, a woman who specialized in family trauma and identity issues. Unlike Dr. Hendricks back home, she actually listened to what I was saying instead of looking for textbook problems to diagnose. "It sounds like you were never allowed to be yourself in that environment," she said during one of our sessions. "You were constantly being measured against other people's expectations instead of being valued for who you actually are." She helped me understand that my family's reaction wasn't really about me. It was about their own limitations, their inability to love unconditionally, their need to maintain a perfect family image even at the cost of one of their children. "Some people can only love others when it's convenient," she explained. "When it makes them look good or feel good about themselves, that's not real love, that's emotional selfishness." For 2 years, I successfully avoided all social media, news from my hometown, and anything that might trigger memories of my old life. I focused on moving forward, building something new, becoming someone different from the broken kid my family had written off. I made friends with my coworkers and classmates, people who knew me as the reliable guy who always showed up on time, who could fix problems and make people laugh. They had no idea about my dramatic backstory, and I preferred it that way. Until Bryn found me. She'd hired a private investigator on her 18th birthday, using money from her college fund to track me down. The detective had followed digital breadcrumbs, my GED enrollment, my warehouse employment records, my community college transcripts, across 3 states to my apartment building in Portland. When I opened my door on a Tuesday evening in March, expecting a pizza delivery, my baby sister was standing there holding a manila folder full of documents and photographs. She'd grown up in the 2 years since I'd seen her, taller, with shorter hair and more serious eyes, but still recognizably the sister I'd loved despite everything. "I knew you were alive," she said, and then collapsed in tears on my doorstep. I stood there frozen, not sure whether to hug her or close the door. Part of me wanted to pretend I was someone else, to claim she had the wrong apartment, but seeing her cry broke something inside me that I'd been carefully protecting for 2 years. I let her in and made coffee while she composed herself, both of us sitting awkwardly in my small living space like strangers who happened to share DNA. "I never agreed with them," she said, her voice shaking as she wrapped her hands around the coffee mug. "I fought with Mom and Dad every single day after you disappeared. I knew you were alive somewhere. I could feel it in my bones." She told me everything that had happened after my fake death, how the family had imploded within months, how the community had turned against my parents when details about their behavior during the search started spreading. "Mrs. Patterson from next door started talking," Bryn explained. She mentioned how calm Mom seemed during the search, how she'd seen Dad watching TV while volunteers were organizing search parties. People started putting pieces together. Apparently, several volunteers had noticed my parents' lack of genuine emotion and started asking uncomfortable questions. Why weren't they out searching with everyone else? Why did they seem more concerned about media interviews than finding their son? Why were they discussing practical matters instead of holding on to hope? "Mom and Dad divorced within 8 months, Bryn continued, staring into her coffee like she was reading tea leaves. "They kept blaming each other for driving you away. Mom said Dad was too critical and demanding. Dad said Mom enabled your problems instead of helping you fix them. The marriage had cracked under the weight of guilt. public scrutiny, and mutual resentment. Neighbors who had initially offered support started whispering about how strange it was that they seemed so relieved rather than devastated. Someone, Bryn thought it might have been Captain Rodriguez, had leaked details about the insurance policy, and people began connecting dots they didn't like. Declan's fiancée left him 2 weeks after the memorial service, she continued. Vanessa said she'd overheard Dad talking to his brother about the financial benefits of your death, and it made her physically sick. She told people at the country club, and the story spread from there. Declan had spiraled into guilt and depression, spending most of his time drinking alone and replaying every conversation where he dismissed my problems or made jokes about my failures. He'd apparently confessed to multiple therapists that he felt directly responsible for his brother's suicide. He keeps your picture on his nightstand, Bryn said quietly. Talks to it sometimes when he thinks nobody's listening. Says he's sorry for calling you dramatic and attention-seeking. Too little, too late, I said, but the words came out harder than I'd intended. They're all different people now, she continued. Dad lives in a studio apartment downtown and drinks too much. Lost his job at the firm because he couldn't focus. Mom moved to Arizona 6 months ago and barely talks to anyone. She works at a library in Scottsdale and pretends she never had a son named Alex. The revelation that Mom had essentially erased me from her narrative wasn't surprising, but it still stung. She'd moved across the country to escape the consequences of her choices, starting fresh where nobody knew about her dead son or the rumors surrounding his disappearance. Declan's the only one who stayed, Bryn said. He's in therapy 3 times a week, guilt-ridden about everything he said about you. Keeps talking about how he should have been a better brother. Good, I said, and meant it. They should all feel guilty. They should all suffer for what they did. They want to see you, she said carefully, watching my face for reactions. They want to apologize, to try to explain their behavior that night. I laughed, but there was no humor in it. Just sharp, bitter sound that didn't belong in my small apartment. Explain what? That they wished I was dead? That they planned to spend my life insurance money on Declan's wedding and your college tuition? I heard everything, Bryn. Every word. Her face went white, color draining from her cheeks like someone had pulled a plug. What do you mean you heard everything? I told her about the recorder I'd hidden in the living room bookshelf, about listening to their conversations while hiding in the Thompsons' barn, about hearing them discuss my death like a business opportunity while search teams risked their lives in those tunnels. I played her some of the audio I'd saved on my phone over the years, insurance against my own memories, proof that I hadn't imagined or exaggerated their cruelty. Mom's voice saying, maybe this is for the best. Dad calculating my monetary value down to the last dollar. Their detailed discussion about acting appropriately upset for the cameras. Bryn listened with her hands covering her mouth, tears streaming down her face as she heard our parents' true feelings about their missing son. I didn't know, she whispered when the recording ended, her voice small and broken. I swear to God, I had no idea they were saying things like that. I was at soccer practice when the police came that first night. By the time I got home, they'd already decided how to handle everything. They told me you were probably dead and we needed to be strong for each other. I believed her. Bryn had been 16. Focused on her own life and achievements. She wouldn't have been included in the adults' private conversations about insurance money and relief at my disappearance. I kept insisting you were alive, she continued through her tears. I made them keep your room exactly the same. I put up missing person flyers around town even after they stopped the official search. Mom and Dad got so angry at me for not accepting reality and living in denial. She'd spent her senior year of high school fighting with our parents about their lack of genuine grief, their eagerness to move on with their lives, their refusal to keep looking for me. When she'd suggested hiring a private investigator with her college fund money, Dad had threatened to have her evaluated for psychiatric problems. That's when I knew something was really wrong, she said, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. What kind of parent tries to stop their child from searching for their missing sibling? What kind of family gives up hope after 3 days? We talked until sunrise, both of us exhausted but unable to stop. She told me about the rest of high school, about getting into Stanford, about her plans to study social work with a focus on family therapy. I told her about my job, my friends, my quiet but satisfying life in Portland. Neither of us mentioned our parents much during those conversations. The topic was too raw, too complicated to navigate in one night. What do you want from me? I asked, as dawn light filtered through my apartment windows. The question sounded harsher than I'd intended, but I needed to know her expectations. Nothing, she said immediately, shaking her head. I just needed to know you were okay. I needed to tell you that at least one person in that family never stopped loving you, never stopped believing you were worth searching for. The simple honesty of her words broke something loose in my chest that I'd been holding tight for 2 years. What do you want me to tell them? She asked as she prepared to leave for the airport. About finding you, I mean. I thought about it for a long time, weighing my options carefully. Part of me wanted her to tell them I was successful and happy, to make them regret their choices, and live with the knowledge that they'd lost someone valuable. Part of me wanted her to say nothing, to let them live with uncertainty forever. Tell them I forgave them, I said finally, after watching the morning traffic build on the street outside my window. But tell them I can never trust them again. Tell them I'm happy, I'm healthy, and I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. Will I see you again? She asked, her voice small and hopeful. Maybe, I said honestly, when you graduate college, if you want to, and if you can respect my boundaries about the rest of the family. She hugged me goodbye, the first physical affection I'd received from anyone in my biological family for over 2 years, and promised to respect my privacy. She also promised to stop fighting with our parents about my disappearance, to let them believe whatever they needed to believe about my fate. "I won't tell them I found you unless you want me to," she said. "This is your choice, your life now." After she left, I sat in my apartment feeling emotionally drained, but somehow lighter than I'd felt in years. Knowing that at least one member of my family had genuinely mourned my disappearance, had never stopped looking for me, had loved me enough to hire a detective and fly across the country, it didn't heal all the wounds, but it helped. 6 months later, I received a package with no return address and a Portland postmark. Inside was a newspaper clipping from my hometown announcing my father's death from liver failure. He'd drunk himself to death within 3 years of my fake disappearance, unable to cope with the guilt and community judgment that followed the rumors about his behavior during the search. The obituary was brief and formal. Thomas Alexander Morrison, 52, died peacefully at Riverside General Hospital after a long illness. He is survived by his daughter Bryn Morrison of Palo Alto, California, his son Declan Morrison of Columbus, Ohio, and son Alex Morrison, whose location remains unknown. I read the notice 3 times, waiting to feel something: sadness, satisfaction, closure, anger. Instead, I felt nothing, just emptiness where complicated father-son emotions should have been. The article mentioned that services would be private, with donations suggested to the National Alliance on Mental Illness in lieu of flowers. I wondered if that was Bryn's idea, a way to honor the mental health struggles that had torn our family apart. Mom apparently didn't attend the funeral. According to a follow-up text from Bryn, we'd been exchanging messages every few months. She'd completely cut contact with everyone from our old life after moving to Arizona. She was living under her maiden name and had told her new co-workers that she'd never been married or had children. "It's like she erased our entire family from her memory," Bryn wrote. "Dad died alone except for me and Declan. Even his brothers barely showed up." 2 years later, Bryn graduated valedictorian from Stanford with a degree in psychology and social work. I watched the live stream of her commencement ceremony, proud of her accomplishments, but careful to stay hidden in my Portland apartment. I could see Mom in the audience during the ceremony, looking decades older than her 56 years. Her hair had gone completely gray, and she seemed smaller somehow, diminished by the weight of her choices. She kept scanning the crowd during Bryn's speech, probably hoping I'd surprise them by showing up for my sister's big day. I didn't. Bryn had kept her promise and never told them she'd found me. As far as they knew, I was still missing, still possibly dead, still the son who'd disappeared into those storm drains and never come home. Some bridges, once burned, can never be rebuilt. Some words, once spoken, can never be unheard. Some betrayals cut so deep that forgiveness becomes irrelevant because trust is impossible to restore. I have a good life now, 5 years after faking my death to escape my toxic family. I manage inventory and logistics for a sustainable clothing company that values creativity and ethical business practices. I have genuine friends who chose to love me without knowing my dramatic backstory. I'm engaged to someone named Riley who thinks I'm worth fighting for, who sees my value beyond my ability to produce achievements or maintain a perfect image. Riley knows the basics of my story, that I'm estranged from my family due to their inability to love me unconditionally, but I've never played the recordings or shared the specific details of their cruelty. Some wounds are too private to expose, even to people we trust completely. But sometimes, late at night when insomnia strikes and my mind wanders to dark places, I still hear my mother's voice on that recording saying, "Maybe this is for the best." I still hear my father calculating my worth in insurance dollars. I still hear my brother discussing how to perform grief for the cameras while real people risked their lives searching for my body. That recording taught me the most painful lesson of my life. The people who claim to love you most can be the ones planning your funeral while you're still breathing. The family that raised you can see you as nothing more than a problem to be solved, a burden to be relieved, a financial opportunity disguised as a tragedy. I've never gone back home to Ohio. I've never reached out to Mom or Declan, despite Bryn's occasional suggestions that they've changed, that they feel guilty about their behavior, that they might be ready to have an honest conversation about what happened. Bryn visits me once a year during spring break, and we've built a careful relationship based on honesty, respect for boundaries, and mutual understanding that family is more than shared DNA. She's studying for her master's degree in family therapy now, partly inspired by our own dysfunctional background. "I want to help other families before they get to where we were," she told me during her last visit. "I want to teach parents how to love their kids unconditionally, even when they're struggling or different or not meeting expectations." Last month, she called with news that felt like a final chapter in a book I'd been trying to close for years. "Mom's dead," she said simply. No emotional preamble or gentle lead-up. Heart attack in her apartment in Scottsdale. Her neighbor found her after 3 days. I waited for grief to hit, for some complicated mix of sadness and relief. Instead, I felt the same emptiness I'd experienced when Dad died, a complete absence of filial emotion where love and loss should have been. "How do you feel about it?" I asked, genuinely curious about her reaction. "Sad," she said honestly. Not because of who she became, but because of who she could have been, because of what our family could have been if she'd been capable of loving us the way we deserved. The funeral was private again, with only Bryn, Declan, and a few distant relatives attending. Mom had left behind a tiny estate, mostly consisting of her library job pension and the modest Arizona apartment that was split between her surviving children. "There's a life insurance payout," Bryn said carefully. "Not much, but enough to matter. She left equal shares to me, Declan, and you." The irony wasn't lost on either of us. After calculating my death benefits and fantasizing about how my life insurance would improve their lives, Mom had left me money in her will, as if financial inheritance could somehow compensate for emotional abandonment. I don't want it, I said immediately. Give my share to charity or keep it yourself. I don't want anything from her. I figured you'd say that, Bryn replied. I'll donate it to that mental health organization Dad mentioned in his obituary. Seems appropriate. We talked for another hour about memories, regrets, and the strange process of grieving people who'd hurt us so deeply. Bryn was in therapy herself now, working through her own trauma from growing up in a family that valued appearance over authenticity, achievement over emotional health. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you'd never faked your death? She asked toward the end of our conversation. If you just stayed and tried to work things out? I considered the question seriously. I think they would have kept treating me like a burden and a disappointment until I either actually hurt myself or just disappeared in a less dramatic way. The recording proved they didn't love me. They loved the idea of having a successful son, but they couldn't handle the reality of who I actually was. You're probably right, she agreed sadly. I just wish things could have been different. They could have been, I said, if they'd chosen to love me instead of judge me, if they'd seen me as a person worth supporting instead of a problem to be fixed or eliminated. That conversation was 6 months ago. Since then, I've been reflecting on the strange trajectory that brought me from a suicidal college dropout to a successful warehouse manager with a loving partner and a chosen family of friends who actually care about my well-being. The recordings are still on my phone, stored in a password-protected folder I haven't opened in over a year. Sometimes I think about deleting them, letting go of the evidence, moving forward without carrying proof of their cruelty. But they serve as a reminder of what conditional love looks like, insurance against ever accepting less than I deserve from the people in my life. Riley and I are planning our wedding for next spring. Bryn will be my maid of honor, the only family member who earned the right to celebrate this milestone with me. She's bringing her girlfriend, Carmen, whom she met in graduate school, and who understands complex family dynamics because of her own complicated background. Are you happy? Bryn asked me during her last visit to Portland, as we sat on my apartment balcony watching the sunset over the city skyline. I thought about the question carefully, considering not just my current contentment, but the journey that brought me here. Yes, I said honestly, not because everything worked out perfectly, but because I learned to build a life around people who value me for who I am, rather than what I achieve or how well I fit their expectations. I'm proud of you, she said quietly, for surviving, for building something good out of something terrible. That night, after she'd gone back to her hotel, I did something I'd never done before. I called Miguel, my former supervisor who'd become a mentor and friend, and told him the entire story. About faking my death, about the recordings, about discovering that my family saw me as expendable. Jesus, he said when I finished. No wonder you were so determined to prove yourself when you started here. You were trying to show that you were worth keeping around. He was right. For years, I'd been working overtime to demonstrate my value to everyone in my life, terrified that people would abandon me if I wasn't useful enough or successful enough. You know that's not how real love works, right? Miguel continued. People who actually care about you don't keep score. They don't make you earn their affection over and over again. It was a lesson I was still learning, even 5 years later. But surrounded by friends like Miguel, a partner like Riley, and a sister like Bryn, I was slowly understanding what unconditional acceptance actually felt like. I recorded my family's reaction when they thought I died, and now I can never look at them the same way. Because I learned that sometimes the people who are supposed to love you most are the ones who will calculate your value in dollars while your body is still missing. I learned that family doesn't automatically mean love, and that blood relationships don't guarantee loyalty or kindness, but I also learned that you can build a new family from the people who choose to see your worth, who support your growth, who love you for who you are, rather than who they want you to become. The recordings taught me to recognize conditional love and reject it completely. They taught me that my worth isn't determined by other people's ability to appreciate it. Most importantly, they taught me that survival sometimes requires walking away from toxicity, even when it wears the mask of family. Some wounds heal crooked and stay that way forever. Some lessons can only be learned through betrayal and abandonment. Some families are meant to be left behind so you can find the people who actually deserve your love. I've never gone back home, and I never will. But I'm home now, in a life I built with my own hands, surrounded by people who chose to stay. And that's worth more than any inheritance they could have left me.